The Paris Peace Conference, which we saw reconfigured Europe at the close of World War I, and the post-war settlements, we saw how these Ruthenians, or in the modern term Ukrainians, living in lands of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, now after the war found themselves not only within Poland, which we discussed last time, but also within Czechoslovakia and Romania. And those two areas, in Romania known as Bukovina, the old Austrian province, and in the new Czechoslovakia, the territory of Transcarpathia, or as it was known at the time, the Subcarpathian Rus. Now, with regards to Romania's Ruthenians and Ukrainians, and where they lived, the former Austrian province of Bukovina, which I just mentioned, had been the most important area before World War I. But these Ruthenians or Ukrainians in Bukovina were not the only group of Ukrainians who lived under Romanian rule during this interwar period that we're looking at. And actually there were three distinct areas in interwar Romania inhabited by Ukrainians. And those three distinct areas were, aside from Bukovina, also Bessarabia and a small area called Maramures. On this particular map, here is Bessarabia, Bukovina up here, and a little chunk of Maramures just to the left, or just to the west of Bukovina. Now, according to the census of 1930, in the middle of our interwar period, the number of Ukrainians, all of them in Romania, was 780,000. And of these, 461,000 were found in this area called Bessarabia, in particular the very southern part of it that touches on the Black Sea. That area, Bessarabia, had been, until the war, part of the Russian Empire. And then, aside from those, were the 302,000 living in Bukovina, very specifically the northern Bukovina, and another 17,000 in that very small area called Maramures, which was in the southern portion of a county called Maramures that was cut off by the new border with Czechoslovakia. So let's look briefly at least two of these regions, the largest of them. And the largest of them was in fact, the Ukrainians living in Bessarabia. They actually were the first to come under Romanian rule. As I said, Bessarabia had been part of the Russian Empire, actually one of those provinces of the Russian Empire, ever since the Russian Empire acquired this area from Ottoman Empire way back at the outset of the 19th century. Now we are in the 20th century, and after the Bolshevik Revolution in March 1917, the Ukrainian Central Rada in Kiev laid claim to Bessarabia, and the local Ukrainians there even set up schools and cultural societies. But in response, the local Romanians organized a provincial council which governed the region throughout 1917 until 1 year later, in January and then March 1918, this Romanian provincial council declared that Bessarabia should be united with the Kingdom of Romania. Eventually, responding to this, if you will, fait accompli on the ground, several countries, France, Great Britain, Germany, and Italy, Japan as well, all signed in October 1920 the so-called Bessarabian Protocol. The Bessarabian Protocol, which recognized Romanian rule over this area. Important to note, this former part of the Russian Empire, now part of Romania, was never recognized by the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union did not accept this Bessarabian Protocol. But here we have now Ukrainians in Bessarabia living under Romanian rule. They actually were permitted to have their own elementary schools. They had about 120 of them, a few cooperatives, also representatives in the Romanian parliament. But this was an agriculturally underdeveloped area, had always been and still was, and where the local Ukrainian populace, as well as for that matter the Romanian populace, depended almost exclusively on small-scale agriculture for its livelihood. Now, whereas the Ukrainians in southern Bessarabia enjoyed minimal cultural and national rights, the situation in Bukovina was almost the complete opposite. Under Habsburg rule before the war, Bukovina functioned as a distinct Austrian province. It enjoyed a wide range of cultural and political autonomy, actually more than any other Ukrainian-inhabited land within the Habsburg Empire. Bukovina, actually in Habsburg realm, was used as a model of how, under Habsburg rule, various nationalities who lived within that province at the time, Ukrainians in the northwest, Romanians in the south, Austro-Germans, there was Poles, certainly a large number of Jews. But after the outset, after the war and the onset of Romanian rule, which began as early as November 1918, right after the armistice, the Bukovinian Ukrainians quickly became worse off than their brethren in neighboring Czechoslovak-ruled Transcarpathia, and even worse off than their brethren in Polish-ruled Galicia. The government of interwar Romania was a parliamentary monarchy headed by a king. The country's main political party represented in the parliament was the Liberal Party, which dominated the government throughout actually most of the interwar years. And this, despite its name, Liberal Party, strove to create a centralized state. No area of the country had any particular autonomous rights, with the result that the old Habsburg Austrian provincial diet in Bukovina the governmental administration, specifically in Bukovina, all of these, the school board, specifically for Bukovina, all were abolished. And while, on the one hand, as an administrative unit, Bukovina survived nominally until 1932. After that, it was simply divided into 5 Romanian counties. In effect, Ukrainian cultural and political life, which had thrived under Austrian Habsburg rule before the war, was virtually ended, especially during that first decade, 1918 to 1928, when actually Ukrainian-inhabited Bukovina was placed under and ruled by martial law for the whole decade. And during that period, all Ukrainian cultural societies were closed that had been established under the Austrians. The use of the Ukrainian language ended in the court system. All Ukrainian newspapers were banned. And as for the educational system, it was subjected to a policy of Romanianization. From the very beginning, the Romanian language was introduced as the language of instruction, although at least by the early period, for instance, in the 1922-1923 school year, there were still 255 schools using Ukrainian left over from the Austrian period. And so at least Ukrainians had some kind of legal status as a national minority. However, in July 1924, a new law was passed. And this law actually classified, and I quote, Ukrainians were, quote unquote, Romanians who had forgotten their native tongue. The Romanianization of schools was subsequently intensified so that by 1927 it was complete. Quite simply, there were no more Ukrainian language elementary schools in Bukovina. And at the secondary level, all Ukrainian gymnasia, those academic high schools, all technical schools, Ukrainian, were closed in the 1920s, as well as all of the departments or chairs of Ukrainian subjects that had existed at the University of Chernivtsi in the administrative capital of Old Austrian Bukovina. The political situation did actually improve somewhat after 1927. Why? Because the main rival to the Liberal Party, Romania's National Peasant Party, now began for a couple years to dominate the Romanian government. As a result, they were more liberal than the Liberal Party, and they allowed the existence or the creation of a Ukrainian National Party, even a daily newspaper and weekly were now being published in Ukrainian. Some representatives, deputies in the Romanian parliament of Ukrainian background. But after a brief reversal of political situation, Ukrainian political and cultural activity was now overshadowed when the Liberal Party came back in power in 1932. And so throughout the 1930s and by the end of the decade, Romania's parliamentary democracy had become a sham. The country was transformed into an authoritarian dictatorship headed by the king, whose name was Karol II. And by the second half of the 1930s, his fascist military supporters, a movement came to be known as the Iron Guard. Had now become the dominant force in Romanian political life. These Romanian fascists had not the slightest sympathy for any of the country's national minorities, whether they be the particularly hated, on the standpoint of them, Magyars or Hungarians, who actually formed close to 8% of the population of Romania, as well as the theoretically non-existent Ukrainians of Bukovina. Now, in contrast to the situation in Romania, and I might say also in contrast to the situation of Poland, which we looked at last time, where the political, cultural, and socioeconomic situation among Ukrainians worsened in comparison with the pre-1914 era of Austro-Hungarian rule. The status of the East Slavic population, that is these Transcarpathian Ruthenians in Czechoslovakia, actually improved, especially in the social sphere, and in particular, as we're going to see, the cultural sphere. The local East Slavic inhabitants are still officially known by their historic name Rusyns, or in English Ruthenians, or Subcarpathian Rusyns. When we were discussing the reconfiguration of post-World War I Europe in the Paris Peace Conference, we saw that this group of people, Ruthenians, future Ukrainians, had voluntarily joined the newly created Czechoslovak Republic in May 1919. And in effect, they inhabited the only territory within present-day Ukraine which had received specific guarantees for self-government according to the provisions of the post-war peace settlements, in particular the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which was one of the treaties of the Paris Peace Conference. And finally, the Republic of Czechoslovakia, headed by the renowned scholar and publicist, a man named Tomáš Masaryk, this country considered itself a Slavic state, Czechs, Slovaks, now these Carpatho-Rusynians or Rusyns, despite the fact that they were all already also close to 3.2 million Germans, but nonetheless considered this a Slavic state, officially one. And as a result of that, it was favorably disposed toward its fellow Slavic brethren in the Far East, that is, in Transcarpathia. By the way, Czechoslovakia's favorable attitude was also extended to Ukrainian emigres, political emigres from Polish-ruled Galicia and Soviet-ruled Ukraine, who fled and settled in many parts of Europe, but in particular in Czechoslovakia's capital, Prague, which became the leading intellectual center of Ukrainian emigre life, for that matter also Russian emigre life. There was even a Ukrainian university, Ukrainian Free University in Prague, a Russian Free University in Prague, all supported significantly by the Czechoslovak government. And so it was in this context that these Carpatho-Rusyns, Ukrainians of Transcarpathia, found themselves now in this favorable pro-Slavic political environment. Now, in the realm of politics, this entire interwar period in Transcarpathia was characterized by two phenomena. One of these was related to the entry for the first time of local Carpatho-Rusyns into a democratic parliamentary system. The second phenomena was a struggle between local demands for political autonomy and the interest of Czechoslovakia's government in centralization. This new Czechoslovak state was formed as a republic, had a bicameral central parliament in Prague, an elected House of Deputies, and an elected Senate, government headed by an elected president who held office for 7 years, and the first and longest of them was this Tomáš Masaryk that I've just mentioned. What is in particular useful to note that throughout Central Europe, that is, in those new countries that were created out of the old empires, running from the Baltic countries in the north, all through this period, right down into the Balkan area, from the Baltic to the Balkans. All these small, which were known as successor states, all of them began as parliamentary democracies. But all of them, with one exception, by the 1930s, the second decade of our interwar period, all of them, if not before, became authoritarian dictatorships. The one exception was Czechoslovakia, which until the very end of this interwar period maintained a liberal democratic system marked by representative government and the rule of law. And that was to have a very positive impact on life in Transcarpathia. Now, this did not mean that there was an absence of problems, political problems. Whereas a distinct province known officially as Subcarpathian Rus, as you can see it marked out here and also on this map, it was a distinct province established in 1920. It had its own governor. It did not, however, include all, to quote the international treaties, Ruthenians living south of the Carpathians, specified in the Treaty of Saint-Germain. And so all of the Ruthenians numbered at this time about 460,000. But 20% of them did not live in Subcarpathian Rus, but just to the west in northeastern Slovakia. Or put it another way, the boundary of Slovakia placed 20% of them, around 85,000, under a Slovak administration. And while autonomy was promised at least the Subcarpathian Rus, the provisions of that autonomy were never spelled out, certainly not spelled out in the beginning. Had this statement in the treaty, also in the Czechoslovak constitution, that this area is supposed to have autonomy. What specifically that autonomy was to mean, not spelled out. And so it is not surprising that the very first governor who was appointed by President Masaryk to administer Subcarpathian Rus, he was that Russian-American immigrant lawyer from Pittsburgh who helped bring this area into Czechoslovakia, and as a result he was made governor of the province. I may have mentioned this before, I don't know, but an American citizen, of which he was, cannot hold office in another country unless you get special dispensation from the president. And in this particular case, he received special dispensation from the President of the United States to become governor, which was somewhat exceptional. American newspapers made a big deal of this. But what did he do? He immediately raised the questions, okay, we have autonomy, what is it? And we need it now. One, autonomy, and the other thing, all Ruthenians, also those under Slovak administration, from his perspective temporary, should be part of this autonomous province. The Czechoslovak response to this was very similar to the old Austrian Habsburg approach to politics. Summed up in one word, procrastination. The central government in Prague responded that autonomy could not be implemented. And why? Because the population was allegedly not yet mature enough to participate in a modern democratic political process, and because many of the local leaders, especially the traditionally influential Greek Catholic clergy, were suspected of favoring a return to Hungarian rule. And so until this transitional period, of course, how long was it? Undetermined, but until that transitional, or if you will, educative period was completed, the Czechoslovak regime felt that it would have to administer the region directly. And so these two basic demands of Transcarpathian political activists, that is, one, autonomy, two, unity of all Carpatho-Rusyns into one province, those two basic demands were never fulfilled under this First Czechoslovak Republic, which lasted until September 1938. Now, despite these setbacks, the Transcarpathian Ruthenians did become politically educated during this interwar period. For the first time, the bulk of the population participated in free elections held at the village level, the county level, the provincial level, the national level. Transcarpathians were elected to both houses of the Czechoslovak parliament, where they took an active part in the legislative process. And there were even the trappings of a provincial state-like identity. The region had its own Subcarpathian Rusyn national hymn and its own official provincial emblem, coat of arms, displayed as part of the Czechoslovak all national coat of arms. Now, Subcarpathian Rus, when you look at this map, the one on the left, also had important geopolitical connotations. This interwar period found Czechoslovakia surrounded on almost all sides by enemies. Certainly Hungary to the south, even the neighboring Slavic country Poland, but most particularly from the 1930s, Germany. So basically surrounded on all sides. The most significant threat was posed by Hungary, which felt that it suffered a profound injustice by the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Trianon that was signed in 1920 that lopped off 2/3 of the old Hungarian kingdom and gave it to neighboring countries. What Czechoslovakia got from old Hungary was all of Slovakia and Subcarpathian Rus. And so border revisionism was the dominant slogan throughout the entire interwar period of the Hungarian, which was the basis of Hungary's foreign policy, border revisionism. And as I said, Subcarpathian Rus, as well as Slovakia, large chunk of Romania, Transylvania, all became objects of Hungary's territorial designs. And to protect itself against the Hungarian threat, Czechoslovakia formed the so-called Little Entente. Of course, we had the Entente before World War I. Now we have this Little Entente. And that was reached, agreements were reached with Romania and Yugoslavia, both of which were also threatened by Hungary. And if you look on the map, they signed this Little Entente, but the only territorial link for Czechoslovakia with Romania and Yugoslavia was where? Subcarpathian Rus. And so this region, which both Czech and Slovak leaders never even expected to obtain during the post-World War I repartitioning of Europe, it now became an important geopolitical cornerstone of its foreign policy. Now, on the socioeconomic front, Subcarpathian Rus did not fare very well. The traditional agricultural base of the economy did not change under Czechoslovak rule. The area became, at best, a market for products from Czechoslovakia's highly industrialized western provinces of Bohemia and Moravia. Moreover, the only real source of natural wealth was lumber from the Carpathian forests, which did cover large parts of the province. Large-scale industry, non-existent. Vast majority of the population, still 83% in 1930, was engaged in agriculture or in forest-related work. And whatever trade or small-scale industry that did exist was largely in the hands of local Hungarian and Jewish inhabitants. As for the peasant masses, they did benefit from a land reform put in place in the 1920s, did break up the old large Hungarian landed estates, provided up to 82,000 acres of land for 35,000 peasant farmers. And the Czechoslovak government did indeed invest in the province more than it extracted in order to construct hydroelectric plants, modern roads, bridges. But despite such positive developments, the economic situation actually worsened during the 1930s. This was, of course, a result of the worldwide economic depression set off by the changes, well, the crash in the stock market in 1929 in New York. And so in Subcarpathian Rus in the 1930s, mortgage foreclosures, strikes, grain shortages, some cases starvation became a common phenomenon, certainly in the high mountainous areas. Point of this is that this region was simply too far away and too underdeveloped for the Czechoslovak government to have been able to make any substantial economic changes, despite all of its investments. And when I say too far away, you can see from this map, this kind of odd shape of this country, the distance from the farthest point in Subcarpathian Rus in the east to the farthest point here is farther than from this farthest point to London. So just to give you an idea of the length of this country and how far Subcarpathian Rus was from the rest of the country. It's in the cultural sphere, however, that the Czechoslovak regime made the most marked progress. And the contrast could not have been greater between, on the one hand, the attitude of the pre-World War I Hungarian government, and on the other, the attitude of democratic Czechoslovakia, which indeed hoped to improve what it considered the backward cultural level of its, after all, Slavic brethren living in the eastern end of the republic. And so education became the highlight of Czechoslovakia's reform efforts. The number of schools increased dramatically. For example, if there were 525 elementary schools at the beginning of the period, at the end in 1938, 861. The number of academic gymnasia, high schools, rose from 3 to 11. The general level of illiteracy from 78% in 1910, the last census under Hungary, to 40% in 1930, the middle of our interwar period. Now, in these schools, the language of instruction also changed. Remember, before, Hungarian basically was the dominant language. But now, other languages were used. They're all responding to the needs of the local East Slavic population. And those languages actually varied from class to class. Either the language of instruction was the local Russian vernacular, or standard Ukrainian, or standard Russian. The diversity of language of instruction reflected the problem of national identity. And I'll turn to that in a moment. Also, during these interwar years, the first long-lasting cultural organizations came into being. The most important were the Prosvita Society, which means enlightenment, the Dukhnovych Society, named after the 19th century Carpatho-Rusyn national awakener. Each of these societies had major buildings in the administrative capital of the region called Uzhhorod. They set up branches and reading rooms throughout the province, published a whole series of books and pamphlets, scholarly literary journals. These remarkable improvements in education and in cultural organizations also accompanied by a rise in literary activity, so that this entire interwar era of Czechoslovak rule coincided with what observers described, and outside observers described, as a cultural and national renaissance in Subcarpathian Rus. Not that the cultural sphere was also without its problems. One of those problems concerned religion and a struggle between competing churches. In a democratic and free environment, which Czechoslovakia was, the traditional predominance of the Greek Catholic Church was now challenged by the Orthodox movement. I had mentioned that on the eve of World War I. And that resulted, for all intents and purposes, a kind of religious war, especially during the 1920s, when there was an increase in the number of Orthodox adherents. So at the beginning of the 20s, there were about 10,000. By 1930, there were 90,000. And where did these Orthodox adherents come from? They were Greek Catholics who left the Greek Catholic Church. And not surprisingly, this rise of Orthodoxy was opposed by the Greek Catholics. And it was not uncommon to see conflict between both groups, especially regarding church property. I mean, you can say, oh, we don't want to be Greek Catholic anymore, we want to be Orthodox. Well, we're taking the church as well. That causes a problem. Even more difficult was the problem of national identity. And closely related to that, the language question. Language also always becomes symbolic of something else. Now, although this problem had existed during the 19th century, it was kind of held in check by state-imposed Magyarization and national assimilation. But now, in this relatively free Czechoslovak Republic, the local East Slavic population and its leaders had the freedom to determine who they were. And so, as was the case in Eastern Galicia and in Bukovina during the Habsburg period in the 19th century, so too now in Transcarpathia during the interwar years, there arose a struggle between pro-Ukrainians, or the Ukrainophiles, pro-Russians, or the Russophiles, and the struggle of their intellectuals to gain the allegiance of the population. One difference between previous Galicia and Bukovina was the presence here in Transcarpathia of a third orientation, the pro-Rusyn or the Rusynophiles. They argued that the local East Slavic population of Transcarpathia was neither Russian nor Ukrainian, but that it represented a distinct Subcarpathian Rusyn nationality. So now you had three possibilities. And in fact, all aspects of Transcarpathian life were affected by these three orientations throughout the entire interwar period, whether that be in political parties, language of instruction in schools, cultural organizations, literary works. And whereas the Czechoslovak state administration, for the most part, remained neutral, sometimes supporting one, sometimes supporting the other, but didn't get overly involved. By the 1930s, the government favored the Rusyn orientation. That is the idea of a distinct and hopefully pro-Czechoslovak Subcarpathian Rusyn nationality. It was in the state's interest, obviously. Now, while both Russophilism and Rusynophilism existed in Transcarpathian cultural life already during the 19th century, The Ukrainian orientation did actually not really make its appearance until the 1920s under Czechoslovak rule. But it happened to be led by very capable political and cultural leaders. These are local people who decided that their identity is Ukrainian. And so before long, the Ukrainian orientation became the most dynamic. But yet, at the end of our interwar period, all three national orientations were still more or less equally balanced in terms of political and cultural influence. Now, to sum up, if we look at the interwar period as a whole, it must be concluded that in absolute terms, and certainly in comparison with the former Hungarian regime, the Transcarpathian Ruthenians, or Carpatho-Rusyns as they were known, made remarkable achievements, especially in political and cultural life, under the administration of the democratic First Czechoslovak Republic. And as a result, of all present-day Ukrainian territories, Transcarpathia, while one of the smallest, was the only one to have had some control over its own political and national destiny during the interwar years. And finally, being at the westernmost edge of Ukrainian territory, present-day Ukrainian territory, Transcarpathia was the first to experience change when Europe entered a new crisis in 1938. And it is to that crisis and its result that we will turn when we return.